When a struggling single mother bought a foreclosed farm for just 100, everyone in town laughed at her desperation. But beneath the rotting floorboards, she discovered something so powerful it would expose decades of corruption and put her family in mortal danger. Before we dive into the story, leave a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing our community grow across the globe. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story is even wilder than this one, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. The county courthouse smelled faintly of mildew and cigarette smoke, the kind of old government building that hadn't been renovated since the 1970s. Ceiling fans spun lazily, stirring warm air that clung to Sarah Mitchell's skin as she sat in the back row, clutching a folded money order so tightly the paper had grown soft from sweat. $100. That was all she had left after months of juggling overdue bills, gas station dinners, and the cold indifference of debt collectors. She had dressed in her one good blouse, the same pale blue button-up she wore for job interviews, though its collar was fraying. It didn't matter. In her lap, her 9-year-old daughter Emma traced patterns on the edge of the deed application form with a stubby pencil, humming softly, unaware that her mother's entire world balanced on what would happen inside this stale, fluorescent-lit room. The auctioneer, a stout man with a red face and suspenders stretched across his chest, banged his gavel against the podium. His voice boomed as he read off the first property, a 3-bedroom ranch house on Maple Street. Opening bid at $75,000. Do I hear 75? 75 in the back, thank you. 80 over here, now 90. The numbers climbed with dizzying speed, hands shooting up, pens scribbling. Sarah's stomach twisted tighter with every increment. She knew she didn't belong here among investors in crisp suits and couples clutching pre-approval letters. She was just a waitress and part-time cashier, trying to survive on the scraps of a life that had unraveled too quickly. But still, she stayed seated because she had no other choice. Tonight, she and Emma would either have a roof of their own or another night parked in the corner of a Walmart lot, praying the security guard didn't notice them. Property after property flashed across the screen. Foreclosed suburban homes with neat lawns, empty commercial lots already earmarked for developers. Prices leapt into the tens of thousands, and with each slam of the gavel, Sarah's hope dimmed. She shifted in her seat, heart hammering. Maybe this had been foolish. Maybe she should have kept the 100 for food, for gas, for something that mattered. But what kind of mother was she if she couldn't even give her child a place to belong? Emma leaned against her, whispering, "Are we going to get a house, Mommy?" Sarah pressed a kiss to her daughter's hair, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "We're going to try, sweetheart." Then the auctioneer cleared his throat, his tone flattening as though even he didn't believe what he was about to say. Next on the docket, property ID, number 1147. Tax delinquent farmstead located on County Road 6, listed as abandoned since 1982. Includes 1 farmhouse, a collapsed barn, and 10 acres of land. Outstanding taxes forgiven under auction clause. Opening bid at $100. A hush fell over the room. Pens stopped moving. Someone in the front actually chuckled. Sarah straightened in her seat, pulse thrumming in her ears. 100, the exact amount in her hand. The auctioneer glanced across the room, clearly expecting no takers. $100, do I hear 100? Silence. No one raised a hand. The farm was infamous. Sarah had heard fragments of gossip in the diner where she worked. Strange lights seen at night decades ago. A family that disappeared without explanation. Crops that withered no matter who tried to plant them. The kind of land locals said was cursed. She should have been afraid. She should have let it pass. But her desperation drowned out superstition. Before she could talk herself out of it, Sarah lifted her trembling hand. 100, she said, her voice barely carrying. All eyes swiveled toward the back row. Some stared with pity, others with mocking smirks. The auctioneer blinked, surprised. I have 100. Do I hear one? 20? The room stayed quiet. 100 once, 100 twice. His gavel came down with a crack that echoed through the chamber. Sold. Laughter rippled among the bidders, low murmurs about that desperate woman. Sarah ignored them, clutching Emma's hand as she rose. Her legs felt unsteady, but there was a strange, fragile pride blossoming in her chest. She had done it. She had bought a piece of land, a roof, a chance. The clerk slid paperwork across the counter, and when Sarah signed her name, she felt a shiver run down her spine, as though invisible ink had bound her to something far larger than she understood. Emma skipped beside her as they left the courthouse, clutching the manila envelope that contained the deed. Outside, the Kansas sun beat down mercilessly, turning the courthouse steps into a blinding glare of concrete. Sarah paused, breathing in the hot wind. She thought she'd won. But the land she had just claimed for $100 was not just a farm. It was a secret waiting to be unearthed, a secret that would soon drag both mother and daughter into a storm far more dangerous than poverty. The minivan rattled along the cracked county road, its muffler dragging like an old man clearing his throat. Dust swirled up behind the tires, coating the air in a pale haze. Sarah squinted through the windshield as the property came into view. The farmhouse sagged against the horizon, its roof caving in like a weary spine, paint long peeled to bare gray wood. Waist-high weeds swallowed the yard. The barn had collapsed into itself, a pile of splintered timbers, jutting like broken ribs. The mailbox leaned crooked, its red flag rusted permanently upward. 10 acres stretched around them, a wild tangle of brush and thistles where once there had been crops. Sarah pulled to a stop at the end of the dirt driveway, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles whitened. In the passenger seat, Emma pressed her forehead against the glass, her eyes wide. "Mom," she whispered, "we're really gonna live here?" Sarah forced a smile, though her throat felt tight. "It's ours, honey. No one can take it away." She turned off the engine, and for a moment the silence was so complete it rang in her ears. No traffic, no neighbors, only the whisper of wind through the weeds. They carried in their meager belongings a duffel bag of clothes, a box of canned food, and a pair of sleeping bags. Inside, the air was musty and cold, thick with the smell of mold and dust. Wallpaper peeled in curling strips. The wooden floor creaked under each tentative step. Emma wrinkled her nose. "It smells like old people." Sarah laughed softly, though unease gnawed at her belly. "We'll clean it up, make it ours." As dusk fell, they set up camp on the living room floor. Flashlights cast weak cones of light across faded floral wallpaper, throwing shadows that looked like reaching hands. Sarah tried to busy herself arranging blankets, unpacking soup cans, but the weight of the house pressed in. Emma curled in her sleeping bag, whispering about painting her new room lavender someday. Sarah stroked her daughter's hair until her breathing slowed, but sleep didn't come for her. Instead, she lay awake listening. At first it was just the creaks of an old house settling. But then she heard it. Faint noises below, as if chains were dragging across concrete far beneath the floorboards. At intervals, whispers floated up indistinct, almost like children's voices carried on the wind. Sarah sat up, holding her breath, telling herself it was only imagination, that old houses always made sounds. But unease coiled tight in her stomach. She drifted into fitful half-sleep, waking at every sound. By morning, her eyes felt heavy, her body stiff. When she stepped outside, the sun revealed the property in harsher clarity. The porch sagged, boards splintered. Vines crawled up broken windows. In the distance, the collapsed barn looked less like a building and more like a grave. As Sarah loaded Emma into the van to head into town for supplies, she noticed a pair of men leaning against a truck outside the feed store, watching them drive past. One shook his head. "That farm will ruin her," he muttered to the other. Sarah caught only fragments as the wind carried their voices. She gripped the wheel tighter, forcing herself to look straight ahead. She couldn't afford to think about curses or whispers. This was their home now. She was all in, whether the farm wanted them or not. The thunder started low, a distant rumble that rolled across the plains like the growl of something vast and unseen. By midnight, it had swollen into a storm that shook the farmhouse to its core, rain slashing against the warped siding, wind howling through cracks in the walls. Sarah lay awake on the living room floor beside Emma, their sleeping bags spread across sagging boards that groaned with every gust. Water seeped through gaps in the ceiling, dripping steadily onto their blankets, the drops soaking into the fabric until everything felt damp and heavy. She tried to tell herself it was fine, that storms like this were normal on the prairie, but the noise was relentless, shutters banging, beams groaning, the house itself seeming to protest after decades of abandonment. It was after 2 in the morning when she felt Emma stir. Her daughter sat up in her sleeping bag, eyes wide, her small hand clutching Sarah's sleeve. "Mom," she whispered, barely audible above the roar of rain. "There's someone outside." Sarah froze, breath-catching. Her first instinct was to dismiss it, just the storm, the sounds of a dying house creaking under the pressure. But the fear in Emma's voice cut through her. Reaching for the flashlight, Sarah thumbed it on, the weak beam slicing across the dark room. She crept to the cracked window, her reflection distorted in the warped glass, and swept the light across the yard. All she saw was rain sheeting sideways, hammering the weeds into submission. Trees bent and thrashed in the gale, their shadows grotesque and twisting. No figures, no movement beyond what the storm stirred. Relief prickled at the edges of her fear, and she exhaled, ready to turn back. Then her light caught something at the base of the porch stairs, half hidden in the churned mud. Footprints. Fresh. She pressed her forehead closer to the glass, heart hammering. The prints were shallow but unmistakable, toes and heels sinking into the wet earth. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet, and they were too small to belong to any grown man. A chill raced through her despite the sticky heat of the storm. Emma tugged at her arm. "What is it?" Sarah forced her voice steady. "Nothing, just mud." But her fingers trembled as she shut off the flashlight. She herded Emma back into her sleeping bag and lay down beside her, every nerve raw, straining to hear over the storm. For the rest of the night, she gripped a kitchen knife in her palm, the metal cold against her skin, her pulse pounding so hard she thought it might shake the floor. Each creak became footsteps. Each whistle of wind through the rafters a whispering voice. She didn't close her eyes until the first gray smear of dawn slipped through the broken windows. When she finally drifted into an uneasy doze, the knife still clutched in her hand, exhaustion had hollowed her out. She awoke to Emma nudging her, the storm gone, the farmhouse soaked but standing. Sunlight fell across the floor in bright squares, as though mocking the terror of the night before. Sarah stood stiffly, every muscle aching, and stepped onto the porch. The footprints were still there, a small trail pressed into the mud. The wind had smoothed the edges, but they hadn't vanished. She tried to tell herself they were old, remnants from children, who might have trespassed months or even years ago, but she knew better. They hadn't been there the day before. Someone, or something, had walked barefoot across her porch in the middle of the night. She straightened, calling back inside to Emma with a cheerful tone she didn't feel. "Looks like we made it through our first storm." But deep down she knew the house hadn't just tested them with rain and thunder. It was keeping secrets, and last night it had begun to reveal them. The next morning brought a deceptive calm, the kind that always follows a storm. The sky was washed clean, impossibly blue, and the fields shimmered with dew. Sarah tried to shake off the unease of the night before by throwing herself into small tasks, sweeping the living room, airing out blankets, clearing branches that the storm had flung across the yard. She was dragging debris into a pile when a voice startled her from behind. "You're the new owner, then?" "Aye." She turned to see an elderly woman approaching, a wicker basket balanced on one arm. Her silver hair was tied in a neat bun, and her thin frame moved with a surprising steadiness across the uneven ground. Sarah wiped her hands on her jeans, forcing a polite smile. "Yes, I'm Sarah. This is my daughter's and my new place." The woman's eyes lingered on the house with something that wasn't quite pity, wasn't quite disdain. "Ruth Harper," she introduced herself. "I live 2 miles east. Thought I'd welcome you proper." She held out the basket. Inside, under a checkered cloth, sat a still warm pie, the smell of cinnamon and apples rising into the morning air. Sarah blinked, gratitude and wariness mixing. "That's very kind of you." "Kindness has little to do with it," Ruth said, though her tone wasn't unkind. "This place, it doesn't keep people. Families move in, full of hope. They don't stay long. Best pack up before you regret it." Sarah stiffened, fingers tightening on the basket handle. "We're not running. This farm might be falling apart, but it's ours. That means something." Ruth's gaze softened, though unease flickered in her eyes. "Suit yourself. But watch your step. What's buried here isn't just dirt." The words lodged in Sarah's mind long after Ruth turned and walked back across the weeds, her figure small against the horizon. She carried the pie inside, setting it on the cracked counter. Emma peeked at it, eyes lighting up, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to eat. Ruth's warning replayed in her head with every bite her daughter took. That night, exhaustion pulled at Sarah, but when she finally drifted off, her dreams were restless. She saw tunnels stretching beneath the house, walls lined with doors, shadows moving behind them. She heard laughter, children's voices echoing in the dark. She jolted awake, sweat dampening her shirt. Her flashlight still lay within reach, but the house was silent. She turned toward Emma's sleeping bag, ready to reassure herself, and froze. It was empty. Panic clawed her chest as she scrambled to her feet. "Emma?" Her voice cracked in the silence. She swept the beam of her flashlight across the room, over peeling wallpaper and empty corners. Nothing. Heart pounding, she darted to the kitchen and found her daughter standing at the window, small hands pressed to the glass. Emma didn't turn when Sarah rushed to her. She was staring out at the collapsed barn silhouetted by moonlight. "I heard them," she whispered. "Children, laughing out there." Sarah gripped her daughter's shoulders, forcing her to look away from the barn. "There's no one out there, baby. It's just the wind." But Emma's eyes were wide and certain. "It wasn't the wind. They wanted me to come outside." Sarah pulled her close. Holding her so tightly, Emma squeaked in protest. The night pressed against the windows, heavy and endless, and the barn loomed like a sentinel of secrets. Sarah knew what she should tell herself, that her daughter was dreaming, that the storm had unsettled them both, that the mind plays tricks in places like this. But as she carried Emma back to her blanket, her own words rang hollow. She had seen the footprints in the mud. She had felt the whispers rising from beneath the floor, and she couldn't shake the truth that gnawed at her gut. The farm wasn't empty. It never had been. The morning light slanted through the cracked windows of the parlor, catching the dust that floated in the air like tiny ghosts. Sarah pushed the broom across the warped floorboards, each sweep releasing another puff of age and neglect. She was determined to make the house livable, even if it meant fighting decades of rot, one room at a time. Emma sat cross-legged by the fireplace, humming as she arranged a pile of smooth stones she'd found outside. "We can make this pretty again," Sarah told herself, though the words carried less conviction than she wanted. The broom snagged suddenly, the bristles catching on a raised plank near the hearth. She crouched, frowning. The board was swollen and warped, the edges curling like something beneath had pressed against it. She tapped it with the handle of the broom. Hollow. Her pulse quickened. She set the broom aside and pressed both palms to the floor. The plank shifted ever so slightly. Curiosity prickled at her skin, sharp and insistent. She looked over her shoulder at Emma, who was lost in her game. Slowly, Sarah wedged her fingers beneath the seam and tugged. With a groan of nails straining against wood, the floorboard lifted. Dust swirled up in a choking cloud. Beneath, a square hole yawned, edges framed by crumbling brick. A rotted ladder descended into pure blackness. The smell rose at once, damp earth, mold, and something metallic. Sarah recoiled, covering her mouth with her sleeve. Emma noticed the movement and scurried over. "What is it?" she asked, peering down. Her small face glowed with excitement, as if she'd stumbled into a treasure chest. "Is it a basement?" Sarah shook her head quickly, panic tightening her throat. "No," she whispered. "At least, not one I knew about." She remembered the courthouse documents, the official blueprints she had studied under fluorescent lights. The farm had been listed as a simple 2-story, with no basement. Nothing about this. She forced herself to shine the flashlight down, her hand trembling. The beam caught rough brick walls, lined with mildew. The ladder descended farther than she expected, disappearing into thick shadows. The light picked out what looked like a dirt floor, scattered with debris. Dust motes spun in the beam like tiny planets. Her chest tightened. Something about it felt wrong, ancient, as if the air itself carried secrets best left untouched. She yanked the flashlight back and slammed the board down, the sound cracking like a gunshot through the empty house. Emma jumped, eyes wide. "Mom?" Sarah pressed her palm flat on the floorboard, trying to steady her breathing. "It's nothing," she lied. Just an old crawl space. We'll keep it closed." But as she gathered the broom and forced herself back into the rhythm of cleaning, her eyes kept drifting to the seam in the floor, the faint outline of the trapdoor now etched into her mind. She couldn't shake the thought. The ladder hadn't looked like a crawl space. It had been built for use, sturdy once, meant to be climbed often. That night, lying beside Emma in the living room, the storm of thoughts refused to let her rest. The farmhouse creaked with old age, the wind clawed at the eaves, but the sound she couldn't escape was the memory of that hollow groan when the floor lifted. A hidden room where none should exist. A secret she hadn't asked for, but couldn't ignore. Curiosity gnawed at her, slow and relentless. What could her $100 farm be hiding? The decision came almost without thought. Evening shadows lengthened across the parlor, painting the walls with fading streaks of orange light. Sarah stood over the warped board, the flashlight in one hand, her breath shallow. Emma was upstairs exploring the one room that still had wallpaper clinging stubbornly to its plaster, her voice drifting down as she sang to herself. Sarah seized the moment. With one hard tug she lifted the board again. The smell rose stronger this time, dampness laced with rust and something faintly sour. Her stomach twisted. She lowered the flashlight into the dark, and the beam fell across the ladder, skeletal but still clinging to the bricks. Her foot hesitated at the rim, her mind screaming warnings. But the hunger to know pressed harder. She placed one foot on the rung. It groaned, but held. Slowly, she descended, her hand clutching the flashlight, while the other scraped against the damp wall for balance. The air grew cooler with each step, dampness seeping through her clothes. When her boots hit solid ground, the sound echoed unnaturally, swallowed quickly, as if the space itself disliked noise. The beam swung across rough concrete. A tunnel stretched forward, low and narrow, vanishing into darkness. The walls bore strange markings, carvings gouged deep into brick, overlapping symbols she didn't recognize. Some were crude, childlike, others sharp and deliberate. She bent closer, her breath fogging the surface. A rusty stain seeped around one symbol, dark and ugly against the wall. She jerked back, pulse racing. The light moved on, catching shapes scattered across the floor. A small wooden chair, one leg broken, another beside it, overturned. A slate blackboard leaning against the wall, its surface scrawled with chalk lines too faint to read. And then shoes. Tiny shoes, coated in dust, lying in a haphazard cluster as though children had kicked them off in a hurry and never returned. Her breath hitched. This wasn't a basement. It wasn't storage. It was a classroom, underground. A chill swept through her, a cold that had nothing to do with the damp air. She turned the flashlight on herself, needing the reassurance of the light, of the tangible. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped it. Footsteps creaked above. Emma's voice floated down, bright and curious. "Mom, what is it? Did you find something?" Sarah's throat constricted. She wanted to tell the truth, to scream that something was terribly wrong, that the house had hidden an entire schoolroom beneath its skin. But the words stuck. Emma didn't need this fear. "Just storage," she called back, forcing steadiness into her tone. "Old junk, nothing important." Her own voice sounded foreign, brittle. She swept the light once more across the tunnel, the carvings, the empty chairs. She could almost hear the faint echo of laughter. high-pitched and fleeting, carried on the damp air. Shoving the flashlight into her pocket, she scrambled up the ladder, each rung threatening to splinter under her weight. She shoved the board back into place and pressed her palms flat against it as though sealing something dangerous below. Emma appeared at the doorway, eyes wide with expectation. Sarah wiped her trembling hands on her jeans, forcing a smile. "Just a crawl space, nothing to worry about." She gathered her daughter into her arms, burying her face in the girl's hair, inhaling the warm, safe scent of childhood. But the safety felt fragile now, paper-thin. Someone had built that schoolroom for a reason. Someone had carved those symbols into the walls, left those shoes behind. Sarah couldn't pretend it was nothing. She had uncovered the first piece of the farm's secret, and she knew she wouldn't be able to stop herself from going back. The house had opened its mouth, and she had peered inside. Now it was only a matter of time before it swallowed her whole. The library was nearly empty when Sarah pushed open the heavy glass doors, the kind of quiet space where even footsteps seemed too loud. She signed her name in the visitor log with hands that still bore dust from the floorboards she had pried open that morning. The woman at the front desk, a silver-haired librarian with sharp eyes, looked her over with a curiosity that made Sarah uncomfortable, but she simply nodded and gestured toward the back. "Archives are downstairs," she said softly, as if reluctant to disturb the silence. Sarah descended the narrow staircase and found herself in a basement lined with rows of filing cabinets and humming microfilm readers. The smell of old paper and faint mildew clung to the air, heavy as a memory. She explained she was looking into the history of her property on County Road 6, and the librarian stiffened slightly. "That farm," she murmured, more to herself than to Sarah. After a long pause, she led Sarah to a drawer labeled 1940, 1955. "Some records are gone," she warned, her voice almost a whisper. "Destroyed, maybe. You'll see what I mean." Sarah loaded the first reel into the machine, her eyes adjusting to the glow of the reader as headlines slid past. Most were routine crop yields, community dances, war bonds. Then a bold headline caught her breath. "Farm School Shuts Down Amid Scandal." The article was brief, unnervingly vague. It mentioned a program for special education children that had operated on the property. No details about the scandal itself, no explanation of why the school closed, only a perfunctory statement from a foundation representative about safety concerns. Sections of the text were smudged, blackened, almost as if someone had intentionally obscured them. She spun the reel, finding scattered follow-ups over the next 2 years. Each was thinner than the last, stripped of detail. "No comment," the articles repeated like a mantra. Then in 1952, the headline stopped altogether. No closure notice, no final explanation, just silence, as if the farm had been erased from public memory. Her stomach twisted. She asked the librarian if she knew anything. The woman hesitated, glancing toward the stairwell as though someone might overhear. "My grandmother used to talk about that place," she said finally. "Said they brought children there from all over the county. Told families it was for learning, for a better chance. But none of them came back the same. Some didn't come back at all." "I do." Sarah's mouth went dry. "What happened to them?" The librarian shook her head. "No one ever said. By the time people started asking questions, the families had moved away, lawsuits just vanished. The foundation dissolved, or so the papers said. But organizations like that don't die. They change their names, hide behind new logos. I think you'll find they still exist today, only bigger, stronger, untouchable." Sarah's mind reeled. She thought of the underground classroom, the shoes scattered across the floor. She thought of Emma's voice whispering about children's laughter outside the barn. This wasn't just a farmhouse with bad plumbing and sagging beams. It was a monument to something dark, something powerful enough to erase its own history. She scrolled further through the reels, tracing names of board members from the old foundation. One in particular leapt out. Whitmore. She'd seen that surname on a grain silo downtown, painted in bold white letters above a corporate logo. Her hands shook as she jotted notes. Each name, each date like a breadcrumb leading her deeper into a labyrinth she didn't want to enter. By the time she returned the reels, her legs were weak. The librarian's eyes followed her. "Some records were destroyed," she repeated softly, as if warning Sarah away. "Be careful. Some things stay buried for a reason." But Sarah couldn't stop now. This wasn't just her farm story. It was a cover-up that stretched back generations, a scar hidden beneath the soil of her new home, and she knew with a cold certainty that she was standing in the middle of it. The night air was heavy with moisture when Sarah lifted the floorboard again, her lantern swinging from one hand. Emma was asleep upstairs, her soft breathing muffled by the storm windows, and Sarah told herself she wouldn't go far, just a glance, just to quiet the pounding in her chest. She lowered herself down the ladder, her boots landing with a hollow thud that echoed down the tunnel. The lantern's light spilled across the walls, catching the carvings she'd seen before. Strange symbols gouged into brick, lines overlapping until they looked like tangled veins. Some were smeared with a dark, rusty substance that refused to fade with time. Her throat tightened. She forced herself forward, her fingers trailing against the cold stone, the flame flickering with every step. The tunnel narrowed, pressing close around her shoulders, until it widened suddenly into a dead end. Except, it wasn't an end at all. A heavy steel door loomed, its surface pitted with rust, but still imposing. A thick chain looped across it, secured by a padlock that looked newer than the door itself. Scratched into the metal in jagged letters were words that made her blood run cold. "Don't open. They hear you." Her lantern guttered, shadows jumping wildly along the walls. She pressed her palm against the door, half expecting it to pulse with some hidden heartbeat. The air grew colder here, dampness turning to chill. She leaned close, listening. At first it was only silence, the sound of her own blood rushing in her ears. Then soft, almost imperceptible whispers. Children's voices, high, fleeting, overlapping. She jerked back, the lantern nearly slipping from her grasp. Her breath came in quick bursts, her heart pounding against her ribs. She told herself it was imagination, echoes of the wind through old pipes. But she knew there were no pipes, no air shafts, just this door, this warning, and the voices beyond it. The flame flickered violently, shrinking low, casting her shadow across the door like a distorted specter. She stumbled backward, then turned and ran. Her boots struck the concrete in frantic rhythm, the lantern swinging so wildly it sent streaks of light across the carvings. She scrambled up the ladder, her hands slick with sweat, and shoved the floorboard back into place with a thud that rattled the parlor walls. She collapsed against the wall, gasping, her chest heaving as though she had sprinted miles. Emma's small footsteps padded across the upstairs hallway. A moment later, her daughter appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes, clutching her blanket. "Mom? What's wrong?" Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came. Her hands shook, her body still buzzing with the sound of whispers that didn't belong in this world. She forced a smile she didn't feel, gathering Emma into her arms. "Nothing, baby. Go back to sleep." But as she held her daughter close, the truth clawed at her. Some doors weren't meant to be opened, and yet she knew, with a dread that settled deep in her bones, that she would return. Whatever lived in the shadows of that tunnel, whatever history the farm had tried to bury, it was calling to her. And one day soon, she would answer. The knock at the door startled Sarah more than it should have. She had been sitting at the kitchen table with a pile of crumbling papers she'd pulled from the parlor floor, trying to make sense of them by the light of a single lamp. Emma was upstairs drawing with crayons, her soft humming carrying faintly down the steps. Sarah froze for a second, half expecting the knock to come again. When it did, she exhaled shakily and rose. Ruth Harper stood on the porch, a shawl pulled tight around her narrow shoulders. The old woman's eyes darted past Sarah into the gloom of the house, as if afraid of what she might see there. "Evening," Ruth said, her voice low. She held a pie dish, but her hands shook so badly the filling had sloshed to one side. Sarah stepped aside to let her in, sensing this was no simple neighborly call. Ruth settled into a chair, twisting her shawl around her hands. For a moment she just stared at the table, lips pressed thin. Sarah poured 2 cups of instant coffee, the only courtesy she could manage, and set one in front of her. The smell of scorched grounds filled the air. Ruth didn't touch it. She just cleared her throat and whispered, "My brother worked here once. Long time ago." The words hung heavy in the air. Sarah's breath caught. She leaned forward, bracing herself. Ruth's eyes glistened, her face pinched with memories she'd clearly tried to bury. He was a groundskeeper, hired on when the farm was still running programs. He told me things he shouldn't have, things that scared him so badly, he left town without a word to anyone. Sarah's pulse thudded in her ears. "What kind of things?" she asked, though dread curled in her stomach. Ruth swallowed hard. They said it was for the children's benefit. A special school, special training. They wanted to make them smarter, stronger. Promised parents their boys and girls would come back gifted, better than before. But it wasn't schooling. Not really. It was experiments. Sarah's hand tightened around her mug. She remembered the tiny chairs, the blackboard underground, the shoes left behind. She whispered, "What happened to them?" Ruth's voice cracked. "Some vanished, just gone. Others weren't right when they came back. Sick, confused. And then whole families started disappearing. My brother said they would load them into trucks late at night, no explanations given. When the questions started piling up, the foundation packed up and the school closed. But nothing was ever answered. Nothing was ever made right." Her eyes filled with tears as she gripped Sarah's hand suddenly, her thin fingers cold. "I shouldn't even be here, telling you this. But I see the look in your eyes, the same look he had before he left. Promise me, Sarah. Promise me you won't go back underground. Leave it buried. Some doors aren't meant to open." Sarah squeezed back, her throat tight. She wanted to promise, to offer comfort to this frightened old woman. But the truth clawed at her. She already had gone back. She had seen the schoolroom, the symbols carved into the walls, the chained steel door that whispered of horrors waiting behind it. She couldn't look Ruth in the eye and lie. When Ruth finally stood to leave, she seemed smaller somehow, her back bent, as if carrying the weight of memories she could never set down. "The land remembers," she whispered as she stepped into the night. "It never forgets." Sarah locked the door and leaned against it, trembling. Upstairs, Emma laughed at something in her sketchpad, innocent and unknowing. Sarah closed her eyes. She had been warned twice now by the librarian, by Ruth. But warnings couldn't erase the truth. She knew the only way forward was deeper, even if it meant stepping straight into the darkness Ruth begged her to avoid. The bolt cutters were heavier than Sarah expected, their orange handles chipped and rusted from years in the barn. She found them buried under a pile of rotting tarps and broken tools, and when she lifted them, the weight nearly dragged her arms down. The chain across the steel door had been taunting her for days. Every night she lay awake, hearing whispers in her dreams, the children's laughter, the scrape of chairs against concrete. It was only a matter of time before curiosity overwhelmed fear. Tonight, that time had come. She lowered herself down the ladder. The cutters clutched awkwardly in one hand, lanterns swinging from the other. The air was thicker than before, almost suffocating, as though the tunnel itself knew what she intended to do. She set the lantern on the ground, its flame throwing long shadows up the brick walls, and positioned the cutters on the chain. Her palms slipped with sweat, but she forced the handles together. The chain resisted with a high metallic whine before snapping suddenly, the sound echoing down the tunnel like a gunshot. Her breath hitched. She half expected something to come rushing through the door, but nothing stirred. She pried the chain away and let it clatter to the floor. Then she pulled on the door handle. It groaned, hinges shrieking in protest as the door swung open. The lantern light spilled across a room larger than she expected. Rusted metal beds lined the walls in 2 neat rows, their mattresses long since decayed into skeletal springs. Beside them stood rolling carts of medical equipment, needles still capped, tubes coiled like snakes. Folders lay scattered across the floor, paper brittle with age but still legible. Sarah crouched, lifting one carefully. The heading read, "Cognitive Enhancement Trials." Her mouth went dry as she scanned the pages. Dosages were listed, notes about phase I failures, names of children marked with red ink. She dropped the file, her hands shaking. Every bed she looked at, every cart she passed, carried the weight of those names. It wasn't just a school, it had never been about education, it was a laboratory. She moved slowly, her lantern throwing shadows across the walls. Rust streaked the ceiling, dripping onto the paperwork below. On one wall, a series of photographs clung under broken glass frames. She raised the light, her stomach twisting as she saw the images. Children sitting stiffly on stools, wires taped to their heads, eyes wide with fear. Some smiled faintly, forced by unseen hands behind the camera. Others looked blank, hollow. At the far end of the chamber stood another door, smaller than the first, but heavier somehow, as if it bore the weight of whatever lay beyond. A staircase descended behind it, vanishing into deeper blackness. Sarah's lantern flickered suddenly, the flame shrinking low. Panic spiked in her chest. She shook it, trying to coax more light, but it sputtered once and died, plunging her into absolute dark. Her breath came ragged. She stumbled backward, her hand brushing against a bed frame that screeched across the floor. The sound reverberated through the chamber, too loud, too alive. In the darkness, she thought she heard it again, the whispers, soft and urgent, rising from the stairwell. Children's voices overlapping, too faint to understand, too close to deny. She scrambled for the door, hands clawing along the wall, until she found the edge and yanked it shut. Her lantern clattered to the floor, useless. She half crawled, half ran through the tunnel until she reached the ladder, then climbed blindly, nails breaking against the rungs as she pulled herself upward. When she shoved the floorboard back into place and collapsed on the parlor floor, her chest burned with each breath. She lay in the dark, clutching her trembling hands together, her mind still filled with the files she had seen, the faces of children frozen in photographs. The farm wasn't a ruin. It wasn't even a school. It was a crime scene. And somewhere below, in the deeper dark she hadn't yet reached, the worst of it waited. She didn't want to return. But she knew she would. Because whatever had happened here had been buried for too long, and now it was clawing its way back to the surface through her. The grocery store was nearly empty, the kind of small-town market where everyone knew everyone else's habits. Sarah pushed her cart slowly, the wheels squeaking as she scanned the shelves. Emma skipped a few feet ahead, humming as she picked out her favorite cereal. Sarah tried to focus on the normalcy of the errand, the price of bread, the weight of milk, but unease prickled at the back of her neck. Something felt off. It wasn't until she stepped into the parking lot, groceries bagged and balanced in her arms, that she saw it. A black SUV sat idling at the far end of the lot. The windows were tinted, too dark to see inside. She might have brushed it off as coincidence, but the vehicle's engine purred to life the moment she closed the trunk of her van. Her chest tightened. She slid into the driver's seat, forcing her hands to stay steady on the wheel, and pulled out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, the SUV followed. At first, she tried to convince herself it wasn't. Maybe they were just headed the same direction. Maybe she was being paranoid. But when she turned off the main road toward the farm, the SUV slowed, pulling over to the shoulder a mile from her driveway. It didn't pass. It just sat there, watching. That night, Sarah tried to shake it from her mind. She cooked dinner, helped Emma with her homework, and tucked her into bed. But the unease wouldn't leave. Each creak of the house, each scrape of wind against the siding, sounded too deliberate. She forced herself to stay calm, though her eyes kept drifting to the windows, searching the tree line for shadows. Sometime after midnight, Emma's scream tore her from a restless sleep. Sarah bolted upright, heart pounding, and sprinted to her daughter's room. Emma was sitting up in bed, her small body trembling, pointing toward the window. "There's someone outside!" Sarah grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the blinds. Every step weighted with dread. She pulled them back just enough to peek through. At the edge of the property, half shrouded in moonlight, stood a figure. Tall, motionless, watching. Her breath caught, the flashlight trembling in her grip. She blinked, and when her eyes focused again, The figure was gone. The yard stretched empty, but her pulse kept hammering, as though the stranger still stood there. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. She sat at the kitchen table with a kitchen knife beside her, listening to every sound. By dawn, when the gray light crept across the fields, exhaustion pulled at her, but she forced herself to step outside. The dew-coated grass sparkled innocently, until she saw them. Tire tracks carved into the earth, circling the house, looping wide across the property like a predator pacing a cage. Her throat tightened. Whoever it was, they hadn't come close enough to break in, but they had wanted her to know. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. Someone was watching her, circling her, waiting. She thought of the underground chambers, the files, the photographs. Someone else knew. And now they knew that she knew. Sarah prepared herself carefully this time. Fresh batteries for the flashlight, an old lantern she had cleaned and filled with oil, a backpack with bottled water, gloves, and her phone tucked in the side pocket. She waited until Emma was asleep, her daughter's small frame curled up peacefully, before she pulled the floorboard open again. The house seemed to sigh as she descended, as though resigned to her refusal to leave its secrets buried. The tunnel greeted her with the same damp chill, but this time she didn't hesitate. Her lantern's glow reached the steel door she had broken open before. She pushed it wide, the hinges screaming in protest, and stepped into the chamber. The rows of rusted beds and scattered files were exactly as she had left them. But tonight, she pressed deeper, her light cutting across corners she hadn't dared to search. She stopped short when her beam caught glass. Rows of tanks lined the far wall, tall cylinders filled with cloudy liquid. At first, she thought they were empty, abandoned relics of some experiment. Then she stepped closer, and her stomach turned. Inside, suspended like grotesque exhibits, floated preserved specimens. One tank held a brain encased in wires, another contained a misshapen form she couldn't identify, its features blurred by decay. Her hand flew to her mouth. She forced herself to move, documenting everything with her phone's camera. Each click of the shutter echoed too loudly in the silence. She reached for a notebook lying on a nearby cart. Its pages were stiff with damp, the ink smeared but still legible. Neural transfer attempts, the header read. Below, she saw charts of dosages, notes on viable subjects, lists of names, children's names. The air felt heavier, pressing against her chest. She flipped to another page. Success rate under 10%, increased risk of cognitive failure, marked as unusable. She dropped the notebook, bile rising in her throat. This hadn't been a school. They hadn't been teaching children. They had been experimenting on their minds. Her lantern flickered as if reacting to her horror. The flame bent sideways, though no draft stirred the room. She raised her phone, snapping more pictures, each one a desperate attempt to capture proof. But the walls felt closer now. The shadows too alive. She heard it again, the whispers. Faint, overlapping, just at the edge of hearing. They seemed to seep from the tanks, from the stairwell at the back, from the walls themselves. She turned, her light catching the far door she hadn't yet opened. A staircase descended into deeper darkness, steps slick with damp moss. The whispers grew louder when she stepped toward it. Her flashlight's beam wavered, then sputtered. She smacked it, desperate. But the light dimmed and died, plunging her into blackness. Her breath came ragged. The lantern guttered, its flame shrinking, shadows leaping higher on the walls. She stumbled back, tripping over a fallen cart, her phone slipping from her pocket and clattering across the floor. Panic clawed at her throat. She scrambled toward the door, fingers brushing the cold steel frame, and shoved it closed behind her. She ran, the tunnel stretching endlessly ahead, her lantern flickering lower with every step. By the time she reached the ladder, her legs shook so badly she nearly fell climbing out. She collapsed on the parlor floor, gasping for air, sweat soaking her clothes. Her phone was still below, left behind among the tanks and notebooks. Her proof. But even without it, she knew. This wasn't just a farm. This wasn't even just a laboratory. It was a place built to erase innocence, to fracture minds, to bury truths too dangerous for the world above. And now she wasn't sure she would survive long enough to tell anyone about it. The envelope was heavy, its paper cheap but thick, and it lay on the porch as though someone had placed a stone there intended to be seen and to be feared. Sarah found it just after dawn, the sky a flat pewter above fields, still slick with last night's rain. Her fingers trembled as she slit the flap. Inside, photographs slid into her palm like wet fish. The first was a grainy shot of the grocery store parking lot, her van, Emma's legs as the child hopped from the cart, the black SUV half hidden behind a row of trucks. The second showed them on the road home, laughing, their faces turned toward one another, unaware. The third was worse. It had been taken through the bedroom window at 2 a.m. The angle was close enough to see Emma's sleeping profile, the soft curl of eyelashes. The flash had painted the room with an intrusive white. Her skin prickled as she realized someone had been there, watching while they slept. Beneath the photos lay a single note, the letters harsh and blocky, cut from the deliberation of someone who did not want to be traced by handwriting style. "Stop digging," it said, "or your daughter is next." No signature. No evidence of a postage mark. No fingerprints that she could see with the naked eye. The sentence sat there like a verdict. Her knees buckled, and she slid down onto the porch step, the envelope spilling out photographs that seemed suddenly obscene, barbaric trophies of a life being surveilled. Emma's small face swam into view when Sarah lifted her head. The child had wandered outside with a stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest, eyes blinking sleep away. "Mom?" she asked. The single syllable scraped at Sarah's nerves. She gathered Emma into her arms as if she could make some shape of protection from her own 2 hands. The warmth of her daughter grounded her, but it also sharpened the edges of the threat until they glittered. Whoever had sent the envelope had been close enough to photograph their bedroom at night and bold enough to lay the evidence where Sarah would find it. Someone had gone to lengths to make the warning personal and intimate. It was no longer a question of curiosity, of uncovering some buried injustice. It was now about immediate danger to the person she loved most. The town that morning felt smaller, more conspiratorial. Sarah drove into town like a woman moving through molasses. Every windshield she passed seemed to hold a reflection she did not want to meet. She pulled into the library parking lot because it was neutral ground and because she needed the anonymity of the building's steady hum, the scratch of pages, the whisper of patron voices. Ruth Harper was there. The elderly neighbor's face looked drawn, a map of worry lines. She reached for Sarah's hand without preamble. "I thought it would come back," she murmured, as if finding the envelope had confirmed a fear she had carried for decades. "I found photos," Sarah said. Her voice was thin, a blade worn from too much use. She could not bring herself to tell Ruth about the window photo. That felt too much like exposing Emma's vulnerability to the world. But Ruth's small hand squeezed hers fiercely. "They want you scared," she said. Scared enough to leave. Her eyes darted around as if expecting to see someone in the stacks. "I told you the day we met. You don't understand what those men do." The threat had a chemical effect on her anger, and an animal protectiveness warred with numbness. The photographs were a message and a challenge. They assumed she had some limit, a point at which fear would become submission. Sarah felt the old computations her life required: how to pay bills, how to make labor stretch a mile farther than its measly wage allowed, how to keep Emma fed and clothed and in school. She added one more variable now, the cost of silence. If she bowed, if she left the farm and pretended she had never pried up the floorboard, if she burned the memory of the tanks and the notebooks so that no one else would be tempted to look, then she might save her daughter tonight. But what of those children whose names she had seen in the files, the ones in the photos and the notes? Their lives had already been erased. To stay silent was to be complicit in an ongoing theft of truth. That afternoon she locked the photographs in the top drawer of her kitchen table and went to work like a woman performing a ritual meant to steady her nerves. Each plate she washed, each stack of linens she folded, was a litany against panic. But when she closed the door that night and checked the window again, the porch light burned a little lower, an ordinary domesticity now, an armor she wore against a violence she understood more than she wanted. The envelope had confirmed the danger, but it had also lit a fuse. If they had the nerve to threaten her child, then her next moves had to be bolder, smarter, and less visible. She spent hours that night considering options that were both pragmatic and reckless, going to the police and risking the file being suppressed, packing up and running with Emma and becoming fugitives, burning the photographs and pretending terror had toppled her resolve. Each choice had its own dreadful consequences. In the end, the photograph of her daughter's sleeping face moved her in a way no official report ever could. She could not unsee the wide, watchful avenue of power that had reached into her home. She could not pretend those names in the notebooks were simply archival relics. Someone powerful cared enough to ensure those names stayed quiet. And whatever that cost, she would not let her daughter be another one of their quieted names. Before dawn, she shoved the photographs into her jacket and drove to a payphone in the next town, because no one would trace a call from an empty booth as easily as a call made from her number. She dialed a number she'd found skimming through old clippings in the library. The name of a man who had once tried to pull back the curtain from the corporation, tangled with the farm, and paid for it with his career. Her breath fogged the glass as she stood under the hum of a flickering sodium lamp. When a voice finally answered, hoarse and gruff with the sort of decay that comes from life lived too close to hard truths, Sarah did not hesitate. "They're watching," she said. "They've started showing they'll hurt to keep this buried." The line crackled. On the other end, something like recognition sparked. "Then don't do anything stupid," the voice said, not unkindly, "and bring me what you have." The words were a cautious truce. Sarah found herself pivoting away from the instinct to protect solely by hiding, towards the idea of fighting back with someone who still kept his files. The envelope's warning had been intended to close a mouth. Instead, it rattled a nerve that had been waiting for an ally to pull on. She tucked the photos deeper into her jacket and drove toward the one man in town she'd hoped still had the appetite for such a fight. Mark Callahan smelled of stale coffee and old newspapers. Before he opened the door, he lived in a small bungalow that seemed to be held together by deadlines he missed and stories he could not let go. His hands shook when she placed the photos and the envelope on his kitchen table, and for a long moment he stared at the prints as if they were bad dreams given shape. Then he folded his weather-beaten hands and pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "You've been marked," he said simply. "If they've sent you this, they've already cataloged a way to get to you." She told him everything she could, how she'd bought the farm for $100, about the tunnels, the tanks, the names in the notebooks, and the black SUV that had been following her. Mark listened the way a man listens for the tiny quiver in a sentence that tells him the whole story is worse than he feared. He reached for a file drawer and produced a battered folder printed with clippings yellowed with time. "They changed names, but the money followed the same hands," he explained. He pointed to a scrawl, a foundation renamed. "A boardroom address now, a shell company. I thought I'd ferret this out years ago. They buried me instead." When he looked up, his eyes were the color of tired steel, but there was a flicker in them that felt like hope. "We go public," he said, "but we do it right. We leak everything to someone who can't be bought. We get legal counsel, we create a trail they can't erase." He paused. "And you keep your daughter close." The plan was reckless by design. It had to be. They would be stepping onto a chessboard where the opponent had already stolen most of the pieces. The envelope had been a warning meant to end curiosity. Instead, it had found the one person who could turn fear into a strategy, and that made the danger larger, but the path forward clearer. They left the house under a pall of rain that night, two conspirators bound by a truth that would not stay buried. The envelope lay burned in the kitchen sink, its ashes a small, futile sacrament. Sarah's heart thudded with a twin rhythm, dread and the fierce pulse of hope. The fight ahead would be ugly and likely dangerous. But for the first time since the gavel fell on a $100 bid, she felt like she was no longer the only one who could see the people inside the walls of that underground lab. She had an ally with a ruined reputation and a file cabinet of vengeance, and that would have to be enough. The sound was sharp, violent, unmistakable. Sarah bolted upright in the darkness, her hand instinctively reaching for Emma beside her. The shattering glass came again, nearer this time, followed by the heavy thud of boots on the porch. Her pulse roared in her ears. This wasn't the whisper of the wind or the groan of settling beams. This was invasion. "Mom?" Emma's voice cracked with fear. Sarah pressed a finger to her lips, her other hand already pulling her daughter close. The first crash of the front door splintering off its hinges made the house shudder. Men's voices filled the air, harsh and commanding. "Check upstairs," one barked. Another replied, "We'll find them." Sarah's instincts narrowed into one single truth. They couldn't stay. She grabbed Emma's small hand and pulled her toward the back of the house. Glass crunched under their hurried steps. She shoved the rear door open, and the night air rushed at them, cold and wet. Behind them, the farmhouse lit up with sweeping beams of flashlights. "Run," Sarah whispered. They tore across the backyard, weeds slapping their legs, the earth soft from last night's rain. Behind them, headlights flared two vehicles positioned at the road's edge, now turning their beams toward the field like hunting dogs catching a scent. They plunged into the woods. Branches clawed at their arms and hair as Sarah pulled Emma forward, half dragging her through the thickets. Shouts erupted behind them. Closer now. "They're in here!" Boots thudded against the ground, growing louder. Her lungs burned, but she didn't stop until the faint glimmer of water caught her eye. A drainage ditch ran across the edge of the property, its shallow channel half filled with stagnant rainwater. Without hesitation, she pulled Emma into it. "Down!" she hissed. They crouched low, mud soaking their clothes, the stench of wet leaves and standing water rising around them. The beams of flashlights slashed across the trees. Men's shadows stretched long against the trunks. Sarah pressed Emma against her chest, covering her daughter's mouth with trembling fingers. The crunch of boots came so close she could feel the vibration in the earth. One flashlight lingered, the beam sweeping across the ditch, pausing just long enough for Sarah to taste bile at the back of her throat. Then it moved on. Minutes dragged like hours. "Fan out," one of the men ordered. Their footsteps circled wider, crashing deeper into the woods. Time crawled. Every muscle in Sarah's body screamed, but she didn't dare move. Emma's small body shivered against hers, her tears soaking through Sarah's sleeve. She held her tighter, whispering silently to a God she hadn't spoken to in years. It wasn't until the shouts faded and silence crept back that Sarah dared to shift. She waited longer still, listening for the telltale crunch of boots, the low growl of engines. Nothing. At last, she pulled Emma up, her legs stiff and shaking. Together they stumbled back toward the house, their breath steaming in the chill air. The sight that greeted them stopped Sarah cold. The farmhouse was gutted. The front window shattered into jagged teeth, the door ripped from its hinges. Inside, papers littered the floor like leaves after a storm. The computer she'd been using with Mark lay in pieces, its screen smashed, hard drive gone. The files she'd stacked neatly on the kitchen table were missing. Someone had torn through the place like a predator, stripping away every scrap of evidence they could find. Her knees gave way. Emma clung to her side, eyes wide with horror. Sarah scanned the room, desperate for one small reassurance. Her gaze caught the parlor floor, the warped board near the fireplace. Still sealed, still intact. The underground remained untouched. For now. Sarah pulled Emma against her, rocking her gently, though her own body shook so badly she could barely hold her. They'd lost so much in one night, but the heart of it, the secret buried beneath the house, remained. And she knew then, with terrible clarity, that there was no hiding anymore. The fight had already come to her door. Mark Callahan's kitchen smelled of burnt coffee and ink, his small table buried beneath stacks of yellowed clippings and scribbled notes. Sarah sat across from him, her hair still damp from the storm the night before, Emma asleep on a makeshift bed in the adjoining room. The photographs of the tanks, the notebooks, and the preserved horrors lay spread between them. Sarah's hands trembled as she pushed them across the table. "We can't keep this between us anymore," she said. "They already know." Mark adjusted his glasses, his tired eyes scanning the images. He'd seen plenty in his career, but even he looked shaken. "This is worse than I thought," he murmured. He tapped one of the notebook pages with a trembling finger. "Neural transfer, cognitive enhancement trials. They weren't trying to teach children, they were weaponizing their minds. Sarah's throat tightened. And they were willing to kill to keep it quiet. She told him about the SUV, about the intruders, about the warning note. His jaw tightened. Then it's time to go public. The next days blurred into covert meetings and hushed phone calls. Mark reached out to one of the few contacts who hadn't abandoned him when his career collapsed. A reporter at an investigative outlet known for exposing corruption. They arranged drop points, encrypted emails, disposable phones. Sarah found herself in back alleys and empty parking lots, passing manila envelopes filled with photos, voice recordings, and copied files. She wore her fear like a second skin, but she forced herself through it, Emma never far from her side. When the story finally broke, it hit like lightning. Abandoned farm hid, secret child experimentation program. The headlines screamed across screens and newspapers. Sarah's face was everywhere, the single mother who had bought a farm for $100 and uncovered decades of buried crimes. Her photo, taken from an old driver's license, appeared beside images of rusted beds, tanks filled with murky fluid, and children's shoes left in the dust of the underground. Politicians scrambled for statements. Some called for immediate investigations, others dismissed the story as conspiracy-fueled hysteria. The corporation tied to the foundation issued a statement of denial within hours. "These allegations are categorically false," the press release read. But the photographs told a different story. The notebooks, the files, the faces of missing children cross-referenced with old newspaper clippings, those could not be erased with a press release. News vans crowded the gravel road outside the farm. Reporters shouted questions at Sarah whenever she stepped outside. "Did you fear for your daughter's life? Do you believe the government was involved? What will you do now?" She had no answers that wouldn't unravel her. She clutched Emma's hand tighter, shielding her from the cameras, and retreated inside the battered farmhouse. Inside, she sat with Mark, the walls closing in. "We've done it," he said, though his voice lacked triumph. "It's out there. They can't take it back." Sarah wanted to believe him. But she also knew that exposure didn't mean safety. If anything, the danger had just multiplied. Her $100 bid had bought more than a ruined farm. It had bought her a place at the center of a firestorm that was no longer just about her or Emma. The world now knew, and powerful people would do anything to bury it again. She sat at the table, Emma's small hand wrapped in hers, and whispered to herself words she wasn't sure she believed. "We're going to survive this. We have to." And outside, the world burned with the truth she had dragged into the light. The first week after the story broke was a blur of chaos. The gravel road leading to the farmhouse transformed overnight into a media circus. Satellite trucks parked along the ditch, their dishes pointed skyward, their engines running day and night. Reporters leaned over fences with microphones like bayonets, shouting her name whenever she stepped outside. The drone of generators mixed with the hiss of cameras, a constant mechanical hum that seeped into Sarah's bones. At night, when she tried to sleep, the glow of headlights pressed through the curtains like watchful eyes. The backlash came quickly. Anonymous phone calls flooded her prepaid cell phone, some silent, others filled with static-laced threats. "You don't know what you've stirred up," one voice hissed before the line went dead. Online, the vitriol was worse. Trolls called her a liar, a fame-seeker, a lunatic. They posted blurry screenshots of her license photo next to captions that mocked her as the $100 hoax. Comment sections swelled with arguments, some defending her, many tearing her apart. Emma bore the brunt of it too. When Sarah tried to send her to school, news vans lined the parking lot. Cameras clicked as soon as Emma's small figure appeared. Some shouted questions at the 9-year-old, forcing Sarah to whirl and shield her daughter with her body. Teachers called later, apologetic, saying the disruption was too great. They suggested homeschooling until things calmed down, but Sarah knew there would be no calm, not anymore. She wanted to crumble under the weight of it. Nights were the hardest when the farmhouse creaked and the chatter outside grew quiet. Then the phone would buzz again, another message flashing across the screen. Some warned her to stop before it was too late. Others described in chilling detail what they wanted to do to her and Emma. She curled around her daughter at night like a shield, her eyes burning from lack of sleep, whispering words of comfort she wasn't sure she believed. And then, something shifted. The first letter came from a woman in Nebraska. She wrote that her brother had disappeared in 1948, taken to a special school, her parents never talked about again. His name appeared in one of the files Sarah had released. "You've given me back his memory," the woman wrote. "I thought I imagined him. Now I know he was real." The second letter came from a man in Pennsylvania whose aunt had vanished as a teenager. Then another from Texas. Each carried a name Sarah recognized, names she had whispered to herself in the dark while photographing the notebooks. These families weren't accusing her, they were thanking her. They had lived for decades with unanswered questions, with whispers and shame. Now they knew their children hadn't just vanished, they had been victims of something systematic, something buried too long. Soon the trickle became a flood. Families began organizing, their anger channeled into lawsuits filed against the corporation. Lawyers lined up, some motivated by justice, others by the promise of headlines, but the momentum was undeniable. News anchors who had once dismissed Sarah as a desperate woman now spoke of her with reverence, calling her the whistleblower mom or the voice for the forgotten. Congressional hearings were announced. Senators demanded explanations from government agencies tied to the old foundation. Executives were subpoenaed, their polished shoes squeaking as they strode into packed chambers. Photographs of the underground lab were projected onto screens, rows of rusted beds and murky tanks filling the hearing room with silent accusation. Politicians squirmed under the weight of evidence too grotesque to ignore. Sarah watched from the farmhouse on an old television Mark had salvaged from his garage. The screen flickered, but the sound was clear enough. A senator's voice boomed. "This is not just a story about the past, this is about accountability now." Sarah's breath caught. For the first time since she pried up the warped floorboard, she felt less alone. The fight had moved beyond her farmhouse, beyond her fear. It now belonged to a country forced to reckon with what had been hidden in its soil. And though the threats never fully stopped, though shadows still seemed to linger just outside the window at night, Sarah realized something had changed. The truth was no longer hers to guard. It had broken free, impossible to silence again. Spring came late, carrying with it the kind of warmth that felt earned. The farm, once choked with weeds and shadows, was transformed. Volunteers had cleared the brush, planted grass, and restored the sagging fences. A stone monument now stood in the yard where children once played before being led underground. Names were etched into its surface, rows upon rows of them, collected from files, testimonies, and grieving families who had waited decades for acknowledgement. On dedication day, the sky was a soft blue, and the air carried the scent of wildflowers. Reporters gathered again, their cameras raised, but the frenzy was gone. This time, the coverage was solemn. Families of the lost children filled the space, some holding framed photographs, others clutching letters or faded toys. Sarah stood at the front with Emma, a bouquet of daisies in her hand. Her daughter had grown quieter these past months, maturity etched into her face in ways Sarah wished she could undo. Still, when Emma looked up at her with steady eyes, Sarah saw strength blooming where fear had once rooted. Ruth Harper shuffled to her side, her shawl draped neatly around her shoulders. She took Sarah's hand, squeezing it with surprising force. "You gave them peace, child," she said, her voice thick. After all these years, tears glistened in her eyes, reflecting the monument. Sarah squeezed back, unable to speak through the lump in her throat. The ceremony began with speeches, lawyers, politicians, family members, recounting memories of children stolen too soon. Then silence fell, as each family stepped forward to place flowers at the base of the monument. When Sarah and Emma's turn came, they laid their bouquet down gently, the white petals trembling in the breeze. For a moment, Sarah let herself cry. She thought of the night she raised her hand at the courthouse auction, clutching $100 in trembling fingers. She thought of the footsteps in the mud, the whispers through the door, the tanks lined with forgotten experiments. She thought of the warning note, the strangers in the woods, the way fear had carved itself into every corner of her life. And then, she thought of this. Rows of names now carved in stone, no longer hidden in rotting files underground. Reporters snapped photos as she stood with Emma, but she barely noticed. All she felt was the weight lifting. This place had nearly destroyed her, but it had also given her a purpose she never imagined. She had come here with nothing but desperation and $100 deed. What she uncovered had almost swallowed her whole, yet it had given voice to the silenced and courage to the forgotten. As the ceremony ended, Emma tugged on her hand. Her voice was small but steady. "We're safe now, right, Mom?" Sarah turned, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. She looked into Emma's eyes, the same eyes that had stared out of a photograph taken through their bedroom window months ago, and for the first time she felt she could answer with certainty. "Yes, baby," she whispered, pulling her daughter close. "We're safe, and no one can bury the truth again." The crowd began to drift away, but Sarah lingered, her hand resting against the cool stone of the monument. The farm had been a graveyard of secrets. Now it was a place of remembrance. And in that transformation, she finally felt free. If this story gripped you, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you never miss the next one. And drop a comment below. What would you have done if you uncovered something like this? Your thoughts might inspire the next story.